Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Many analysts have been puzzled by the relative lack of cyber operations and the degree to which Russian forces have stumbled in their information operations in the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. Here to discuss this issue is Christopher Krebs, who served as the first director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, often known as CISA, and now serves as a private sector risk management consultant on issues involving cyber and information security. Krebs discusses and highlights the fact that the Russian invasion was in fact preceded by cyber operations, but also discusses the degree to which adroit U.S. intelligence and the declassification and publicity of Russian information and cyber operations helped to blunt their impact. In discussing the future of the operations in Ukraine, Krebs makes one of the most honest and difficult assessments for any expert to make. He says simply, in some cases, I don't know. But he offers an informed analysis of how we got to where we are and what some of the possibilities might be for what comes in the future. Let's listen in on this truly informative conversation.
It is my honor tonight to introduce Christopher Krebs. He was the very first director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. You may know this, one of the big things they do is election security. So you may have heard his name around, and maybe I'll get into some of that. That was a big part of it. After leaving his office, he joined former Facebook CISO, Alex Stamos, and started a cybersecurity consulting agency. Their very first client was SolarWinds after that whole rigmarole about a year ago. So without further ado, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the kind introduction.
All right, All right, I think I got it. All right, thank you. Thanks. It's great to be back. It was actually January 2020. I was here at the Strauss Center speaking to one of Bobby's classes, and then also the Cyber 912 event as well. And it wasn't my last trip before the pandemic, but it was the best. We could say that. And the intervening 2 years, we've learned a lot about cybersecurity, elections, disinformation, pandemics, Russian invasion. And so what I think I'll do today is kind of tell you a little bit about my thoughts of what's going on in Ukraine right now. And Russia is a formidable operator in the cyber attack space. What happened? But first, Bobby, a comment. Baseball, I think they got the deal. So we need to start working on walk-up music.
Was there?
Yeah, for things like that.
Inner Sandman.
So next time.
You probably want to rush. So.
There you go. So I did a briefing Tuesday evening. It is Thursday, right? Tuesday evening. I did a briefing to a number of House members, and the idea here was they get a number of different perspectives. They get civilian agency perspectives. They get state and local perspectives. They get intelligence community perspectives. But what I wanted to do is help them understand what we were seeing from a consulting perspective. We have a number of multinational companies that are out there in the world that operate in Ukraine, that operate in Russia, and some of the challenges that they're seeing, not just from a information security perspective, but also a geopolitical perspective. What are some of the risks now that companies are facing, not just of operating in Russia, but choosing to withdraw from Russia? What are the risks that are introduced? Not just from people saying, hey, I'm going to retaliate, but all of a sudden you've pulled back your digital maintenance plans on a piece of equipment that's still operating in Russia, and things break and they don't know how to fix it anymore. So what are the espionage teams going to do? So we're trying to help Congress, and this was members of the House of Representatives, kind of look around corners a little bit. Because we continue, particularly if you watch the news every day, it tends to focus on what's happening today, and what meetings might be happening in the next couple of days. And my sense of things, and this is talking to intelligence community members, but also politicians and other government officials here and elsewhere, is that we're 15 days in, and it's just devastating and horrific as it is thus far. It certainly looks as if there's no immediate ending in sight that looks good for just about anybody. So helping them understand what's next, what might be around the corner. And one of the tips, one of the things that we're talking as we talk to governments and businesses is that you need to mentally set yourself up to think about this kind of like you did with COVID. So as I was running CISA, the agency in the spring of 2020, and there was a lot of, hey, we'll be open by Easter, we'll be open by the 4th of July and all that. And, you know, we had all hands calls with our team every week, and we would continually get that question. When are we going to be back in the office? And part of it was like, yay, I want to be back in the office. But a lot of it was like, I don't want to be back in the office. So you had to manage expectations. And the worst possible outcome was saying, let's go 2 weeks, but every 2 weeks, let's revisit. And so what I just kind of set the expectation up front. I can't see us getting back in the office. Again, this is about April 2020 until January of 2021. We're calling the ball right now. It's going to take a long time. I kind of am getting that same sense right now with Ukraine and Russia, particularly from a Russian economic perspective. It is going to be a long time before there's any sort of normalcy in terms of political engagement or economic engagement. So kind of back to the beginning here, talking about cybersecurity. There were, I think anyone would have looked at Russia's history of interventions in the West. So Peter W. Singer's got a great lecture on this, and he talks about how the Russians have interfered in 30 democratic elections in Europe and elsewhere, including the US over the last decade or more. You talk about the assassinations and poisonings of political officials. Some of them, fortunately, like Navalny, survived. Others were not so fortunate. But there's been a history of bad activity. And yes, that includes cyber attacks. 2015, 2016, the Russian GRU, the Military Intelligence Unit, also known as Sandworm, launched 2 different attacks on the grid in Russia. In Ukraine. They took it down just for a short period of time. But nonetheless, they have capabilities. They came here in 2016 and attempted to interfere in the 2016 US election. They have conducted other operations here in the US, collecting information, intelligence, compromising the State Department, the White House, and others, as well as searching throughout corporate networks in the energy sector, in the aviation sector, and the state and local governments for years and years and years. Very persistent, very skilled. And so it would only be natural that if there was a well-planned, integrated, coordinated invasion of a foreign country, that cyber would play a role. They would integrate that with their force packages. And that's not just speculation. They've done it before. 2008, when the Russians went into Georgia, they conducted website defacements and denial of service attacks against Georgian government networks. 2014, last time the Russians went into Ukraine, again, website defacements, denial of service attacks, other destructive attacks. And so there was a significant amount of anticipation and expectation that the Russians would bring a fully integrated package as they rolled in. So what happened? Well, it's almost as if some people are disappointed that there wasn't a whole lot of cyber. There was, in January, website defacements on Ukrainian government networks and financial services networks. Fast forward about a month, and there were denial of service attacks, and there were wiper attacks. So basically, it's ransomware without the unlock feature. So there were attacks. Some were attributed to Russia. Others were attributed to Belarus. Interesting that they're linked together. Others are kind of still in progress, still trying to understand who did it. But the real takeaway here is that the value of cyber operations is in the gray zone. It's everything that leads up to the bombs flying, the bombs dropping, and the bullets flying. Because once you're at that level of engagement with kinetic activity, disrupting, distracting, confusing. There are other ways to accomplish that once you've already crossed those lines. And that's where we are today. Could there be other attacks? There was a report over the weekend that Viasat, a satellite telecommunications and broadband company, was also disrupted and hit with some sort of destructive attack, probably a software supply chain compromise. And there's probably other stuff too, but we don't know because businesses, government agencies, other networks in Ukraine, there aren't people at their desks. They've got their weapons, they're out in the field, or they've been displaced to Poland or elsewhere. So there could be other stuff, but also there's the fog of war. We have imperfect insight into these networks. So I think as time goes on, we'll probably see that there was more. But again, to put it into context, these sorts of cyber operations are really not as effective, as important when real human tragedy is happening. So as I mentioned earlier, though, we're 15 days into this. We're still fairly early on. And this unified approach from the Western governments to lay significant sanctions on Russia has had a pretty severe economic effect. There are some assessments that we'll probably start hearing about soon that the entire Russian economy could contract by anywhere from 10 to 20 to 30%. I suspect it's actually more than that. I think it's going to be difficult for a number of these businesses to re-enter the market. And so once you start putting these pressures on, where they have reduced access to a global economy, global goods and resources, when money isn't as freely available as it used to be, when the ruble is effectively useless, you have a different set of conditions that inform how you act. And so as we look forward, particularly as companies that have come out assertively to say, we are not going to support this regime, and we are out. Whether it's the pure PR factor of it, or as I mentioned earlier, that dependency factor, risk is changing for organizations on a daily basis. Also, if you have no other way of getting revenue, and what worked really well previously was ransomware, cybercrime may become something of economic necessity. And as a congressman said the other day, now you've got Russia that's a wounded bear. And wounded bears can still hurt you. And so as those carefully calibrated red lines in times of peace, pre-conflict, as those calibrated lines change, the decision calculus for how you use your non-conventional, your unconventional, and asymmetric capabilities going forward. As I mentioned, they've already poisoned and assassinated political figures in Europe. So they've demonstrated they have a capability and willingness to use it. And once you start pulling the guardrails off, what does that mean? Particularly as the political climate, economic climate continues to deteriorate in Russia. So again, I think we're still early. I'm not aware, I haven't talked to anyone that has a good sense of how this ends. Obviously, the focus needs to be on supporting the Ukrainians as much as possible, getting them the humanitarian aid, the lethal aid support they need. But the world's a big place, and there's going to be a lot of other activities going on in the meantime. And so we have a lot of work cut out. I think the government has a significant task on its hand, not just focusing on what's happening in Ukraine, but also being very clear that any sort of additional, this destabilizing activity by the Russians is not going to be tolerated. I think to a certain extent they have good insight and intelligence on these hit squads and assassination squads. And they need to eradicate those. They have a good sense of some of the command and control infrastructure and the techniques that the Russians use. They need to cut back on that as much as possible. And that could include cyber command going into Russian networks and making their jobs a little bit harder. But there's a role for the private sector, for businesses, that they have to step up, that we've been talking to them for 20 plus years about cybersecurity and how they need to take it seriously, and that it's not just a technical risk problem. It's not a digital risk problem. It's a business risk. But increasingly, it's also a social responsibility requirement. By all these companies pulling out of Russia, doing the right thing, in my view. And that's what we advise our clients. Get out while you still have a choice. It's 2 weeks when everything's nationalized, or whatever that timeline is, you're not going to be able to control who has access to your intellectual property. So you make the decision now. That's going to bring other consequences. You have to accept that. You have to accept that the world's different now, and you have time to make those decisions. So I think I'll wrap it up there. That's kind of a preview of an op-ed I wrote on the plane down here from DC too. So it needs a little work, but I mean, these are dangerous times.
Fantastic. Well, that tees up a lot for us to talk about. So, y'all, what I thought we'd do is, Chris and I'll have a bit of a moderated dialogue here for 15 minutes or so, but then be thinking about the questions you want to ask, because, of course, the most fun at these events is when you get to raise your questions. And we'll get around to as many people as we can before we end at 6:30. I want to start with ransomware. You mentioned it a few times. You know, if we went back about 6 months, everyone's talking about it. It seems like the most pressing threat, because we weren't thinking as much about immediate escalation risk out of the combat zone. But these things aren't unrelated, since so many of the most prominent ransomware crews operate from safe haven out of Russia. You know, it was really interesting in the run-up to the actual invasion of Ukraine. There was a moment where Russia sort of flashily arrested some guys from the Regal ransomware crew. Did you understand that to be an actual effort by Russia to do the right thing, or was that more of a little bit of the muddying of the waters in the pre-invasion phase?
I have called it gangster diplomacy. I do think that it was at the time, perhaps giving the Russians a little too much credit of having, again, a very strategically coordinated concept for what was going to happen in Ukraine. And so the thinking goes that after 15 years really of not doing anything on cybercrime, and the FBI has tried to work with security services in Russia for years, the FSB not getting anywhere, that this was going to be a breakthrough, that the White House had worked with the FSB to roll up some of these cyber criminal organizations. And the cynics or skeptics, maybe the better way to put it, myself included, were thinking, hey, this is an olive branch maybe that says, hey, don't worry about Ukraine. We can keep doing things over here on cybercrime and make life easier back home in the U.S. And this is what we met in Geneva about, right? This is what you talked with the G7 countries. But I don't. Again, maybe it's early, but we haven't seen any sort of manifestation of that. But what it did establish to me was that all along, from the beginning, the Russian security services had the ability to put some kind of limitations on cybercrime. And in fact, the Kaseya group, our evil hackers, I think DOJ announced today that they had extradited one from Ukraine now. So, but again, it speaks to just this bigger challenge of ransomware in general is when you have a safe haven and a blind eye. And really all ransomware ultimately was operationalizing and monetizing misconfigured systems and vulnerabilities in systems, and it's sometimes user error, and it got out of hand.
So we need to talk about the thing you just pointed to, the responsibility on all of us to level up our defenses, or as your successor, Jen Easterly, would say, shields up. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that in a second. I want to keep the focus on the threat actors one bit longer. So one of the biggest Russia haven groups would be Conti Group. Mm-hmm. It was fascinating to see in the early days of the invasion there was sort of an official statement from someone at Conti Group saying, if anyone messes with Russian infrastructure, we are gonna bring the fight to you. And then they discovered they have many Ukrainian patriots within their own organization, and someone doxed them and dumped all their logs. Now you can read all about it through Brian Krebs.
Yes.
Krebs on Security has the Conti diaries going out. So what do you think is going on here? Are we witnessing sort of an internal, as Pat Gray put it, internal civil war within one of the major ransomware crews? And is that going to actually set back and do good for the ransomware threat once this crisis is behind us? Or is this just a temporary aberration once the Russia-Ukraine business resolves in some way? Are we back to where we were 6 months ago?
So I think what it shows is the cyber criminal underground in a kind of a muddy, fuzzy geopolitical space is complicated. It's intertwined. There are lots of different overlapping. I mean, there are rumors that there are U.S. operators in some of these ransomware groups, or Canadians. So it's not just a bunch of Muscovites. It's more complex than that. But to your point, I think what the last couple of weeks has done is really drawn some bright lines. And there's sides of history, and even criminals have a sense of humanity. Some have a sense of humanity about it. But Conti is reestablished, and I assume it's a more Russian centric. But I'll tell you something else that was going on that after that first Conti statement on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern, or whatever it was, some cybercom lawyers were dusting off some authorization memos and saying, does this change our interpretation of our ability to go after ransomware actors?
Because these ostensibly non-state actors had just invited themselves in as contributors to the fight.
I mean, it's just the whether, well, we won't get into election stuff yet, but people just continuously violating the Stringer Bell rule, documenting your crimes. Don't document your crimes.
As a former litigator, I know no one obeys that rule. To flip it around briefly, so Ukraine's information ministry put out a fascinating global call for volunteers to come to their aid, specifically calling for hackers of the world unite. Come to our aid. Here is a long list of Russian targets. We would really like you to go DDoS and otherwise take down some of those targets. Any reactions to that? Is it a mirror image of sort of this blurring of the state versus non-state combatant civilian line?
So I think this goes back to something I was trying to hit on that I'm not sure I do well at all. Is it really trying to put all this into context, right? So we can talk about cyber, why it happened, why it didn't happen. But again, this is small potatoes. There's tragic events unfolding. Every morning I don't know about you, but it's kind of like check and see if Zelensky's still alive, then you get your coffee. It just the schedule of events. It's just horrific set of events that are unfolding, and there is a piece that we know something about, and so we tend to focus on, but we have to keep remembering and anchoring it against this bigger tragedy. So as I sit here in Austin, Texas, or Washington D.C., or wherever, I get very, very, very uncomfortable with this concept of the Ukrainian government asking for foreign, mercenaries to come in and hack Russian government operations and businesses. I just don't know where it's going to go and how things can be misinterpreted. What if they're, not particularly skilled and they're, using, not cloaking in their activity. They're beaming in from Austin, Texas. Where does this all lead us? But then I put myself in the seat of someone sitting in Kiev. I'm like, I want everyone that is able to help. Yeah. And I want the Russians to feel that. And so there's again, complex situation here. But from a policy perspective, in having the luxury to examine the policy perspective, it is a very, it has a lot of potential to end up in some bad outcomes, in particular because if, in fact, as the political conditions deteriorate and some of, again, those carefully constructed escalation considerations fall away, we don't know what the provocations could be. And so, yes, somebody coming in from an IP address in the US hitting Gazprom or Rosneft or something like that could be seen as an act of war.
It's nice. You're right, though. The moral clarity of the sympathies I think we all have for the Ukrainians makes it hard to step back and say, well, hold on, my fellow Americans, before you get involved here. It feels morally thin to try to discourage people.
Well, and just to be kind of, now we're drifting a bit because we can. The Ukrainians have played the information space amazingly well, and even with the MiG-29s from Poland to Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, they were very effective in cutting through and calling out bureaucratic processes. I need weapons not arrive at home or lift out. So the whole information space around the invasion, whether it's intelligence communities work or just how the Ukrainians have played it, has been masterful.
Let's pivot to that, because the Russians, who've been thinking for so long, were such masters of the information game, and in that space at least, they're getting blown out for the time being. Why are the Ukrainians so effective right now? And why are the Russians so limited in what they've been able to achieve, or even perhaps try to achieve?
I don't know. There will be entire, fellowships at the Strauss Center and every other school that will be funded and dedicated just like what happened here. So I skipped over it. I missed an entire section of my op-ed in the opening remarks. Why wasn't there cyber? And I don't know. I mean, yes, there was, but why wasn't, gas pipelines and telecom? I mean, my assumption was that they were going to come in at the destabilization phase. They were going to knock out power. They were going to knock out pipelines. They were going to take down the internet. They were going to just blanket darkness. And they wanted a complete information blanket. That didn't happen. And what happened as a result? The iconic images of the invasion are Ukraine's. What is the babushka de la muerta, right? the grandmother of death with the sunflower seeds of the Russian troop. Put these in your pocket. You've got the ghost of Kiev. The first ace since Korea or World War II, I guess. The 13 heroes of Snake Island. The airport that was taken and retaken. Now you've got Ukrainian farmers on John Deere tractors that'll have bigger May Day parades than Moscow. It's remarkable how whether it's strategic or tactical decision by Russians to leave the telecommunications networks up led to Ukraine winning the information war. So why did the Russians leave it up? I again don't know. There are three kind of emerging intertwined theories. The first is that it kind of looks like Putin and his inner circle, which has gotten only smaller over the last couple of years, just didn't tell anybody with enough time to really effectively plan. And you're seeing this in the logistics and supply chain piece of the ground war. But to conduct an effective cyber network operation, it takes time. It can take months and months. It can take years to plan it, to recon, to get access, to maintain persistence, and then achieve your outcome when you need it. And look, if they didn't tell things to tell the FSB, the GRU, and the SBR, which are the security services and intelligence apparatus, they didn't give them but a couple months, that they were left with really kind of kludgy, clunky things like the denial service and website defacements, or they had to repurpose existing access, which may not have been for a really high-profile event, which may have left us with Whispergate and Hermetic Wiper, which were two other destructive attacks, or they handed it off to the Belarusians, the Ghostwriter team. So that's not clear. I'm actually more of the mind that they actually assessed the situation. They thought they were going to do a thunder run straight up the highway to Kiev, and there wasn't going to be any resistance. And Zelensky was just going to go up to Munich for the Munich Security Conference and not come back. And it was just, and that was it, done and dusted. So why would we knock down the grid? Why would they knock down telecommunications network? Because then you have to turn the lights back on. You have to fix things. Let's just keep it turnkey. I mean, that makes sense to me. And then the third, that there's a lot of evidence emerging for this, is that the Russians are actually dependent upon the Ukrainian telecommunications network for command and control, for calling back to Russia to say, hey, the commander of the tank regiment just got popped, and General Gerasimov, not that one, but the other one, was killed. So there are all these different factors, but I think to your point about the information war is that we've mythologized Russian military operations. We've mythologized their information operations. We've mythologized their cyber security, their cyber attack capabilities. And, there's going to be a lot of reflection on that. And why that is, whether Eisenhower was right or whatever, but ultimately they were not able to execute it, I think in part because the intelligence community did such an incredible job. And it's still, I'm astonished by how quickly they were able to take intelligence that they picked up from the Russians, declassify it, and release it into the public sphere. In some cases, I understand, like 12 hours. In 2016, that would take a year or more. I mean, the NotPetya, which was a Russian ransomware attack, wiper destructive attack that they launched from Ukraine in 2017. I think the attribution on that was 6 months or even longer. So the government's getting a lot better, and that you can do things like that when you have clarity of purpose and strategic direction, and the commands are given to execute like that. And what that did of calling out Putin, which is, if you go back and you look at a couple of the press conferences at the State Department, Ned Price, who's the spokesman, was talking about it, and there was a reporter that said, what evidence do you have? What other than your words? And they probably could have released the information a little bit differently, but the point wasn't that they were trying to convince the U.S. that U.S. viewers that the Russians were about to do this. The point was to tell the walk-on music's now. The point was to tell Putin that we know what you're planning. Get inside his head, and as a result, what happened? They delayed some of the invasion. And so you had Russian troops, conscripts, sitting at the border for an extra week, eating their food, selling their fuel for vodka. And it was not just a strategic success, but a tactical success, because now you literally have tank columns that are running out of fuel, 50 kilometers in. So it shows that it's not just a good offensive, but it's a counteroffensive tool as well, if you can do it right. And the U.S. government had the right mentality, they had a strategic view, and they were proactive. And that's what's so different in 2020, even in 2016, is that we took the initiative. This shows the greatest disinfectant is sunlight. So they got on top of that, and it can be gained, of course. If the bad guys know where you're stealing the info from, they can start inserting their own. U.S. The allies did that in World War II, some of the invasion plans. But look, I think there's a real dramatic shift in tactics. Now we go up against Russia. The last thing I'll say here is that inoculation is also probably part of the game. You expect Putin to do something, and so here it comes. And so we have a much more resilient population here and elsewhere. And I think that's the key to solving a lot of the disinformation problem going forward, is that we build up steadily resilience and thicker skin. We're still in the very, very early days of these internet-based disinformation campaigns. And so we're adjusting, we're humans, will adapt and evolve. And I think we're slowly seeing it happen.
That's interesting. That's sort of a public health model for how we improve our current pathologies of disinformation. True.
Yes. But sorry to you don't bring risk management consultants for fun, happy conversations. It's like, so the one thing about disinformation operations in and of themselves, though, is that they are on the whole, they have the asymmetric advantage. The point is not to sell you on any one single point and convince you that one thing happened. It's you flood the zone. You want as much there so that the defenders can't defend, and everyone else is just so overwhelmed. They're like, I don't even know what's true anymore. And so I need somebody to tell me what's going on. Okay, that person's really, authoritative looking, sounding, and really believes in what they're saying. So maybe I'll listen to it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.